Good afternoon. Thank you guys for joining us today for the analytical model in Revit. My name is Chris Porter. Appreciate you guys logging in. I see some of you guys came back from our Revit radio, which we had just about a half an hour ago. Always check out the CAD-1 website for our events. You'll see that there's all kinds of stuff coming up. We're also doing one on, I think it's DWFs pretty soon at the end of April. So anyway, we're going to pretty much jump right into this one, give you guys as much as we possibly can. So a little bit about, this is your first webinar. You'll see basically how to type in any questions and also how to get audio. So
the one thing about that too is if we are talking about anything and any questions pop up as we go through, feel free to ask that question as we're going through. Always makes more sense in context than it does when we're looking at it later. The other thing on that too is I am doing this in Revit 2013. Since the 2014, we've all been hearing how great it is and all the new features of 2014. Just always like to go in there and say that right now we don't have 2014. It should be out any time. Autodesk has not given us dates on those times yet. So we've got the Revit 2013 right now. I was hoping to be able to possibly do some of the new features in 14, but since I don't have the product, I'm not going to be going through and doing that. So today it'll all be in 2013.
Also, I mentioned this during Revit Radio for those who just logged in on this one, Thomas and a few other people. If you had Ship Me Media checked in your subscription center, they unchecked you. So once they're releasing that, you should be able to go back there and request that media once 2014 is out. And again, they haven't given us any dates. You can call me, but I'm going to tell you the same thing I'm telling you now. We don't know when anything's coming out. Typically, it's at the end of April. They'll release that. So I would check, towards the last week of April. That's historically when that happens. But again, if you checked Ship Me Physical Media, it has been unchecked. You'll need to log in once it's released and request that physical media.
So yeah, and just on a side note of that, it is going to have to be something you will do every year because it is now download only unless requested, and you have to give a reason why you're requesting that media. So with that said, we'll jump into it. We're going to get into the analytical modeling in Revit. So a little bit of flexibility going on here. Just going to get into some of the settings you have for analytical, some of the settings you get for views, independent properties of each individual elements, and then how we can start going through and adjusting those. So with that said, I'm going to pretty much just jump right into Revit and get into the presentation. So one of the things I like to point out to most of the people once we get inside of here is in the old releases, a lot of people had a template for the analytical model only, the 3D view with the non-analytical settings. So one of the big things I like to talk about that was a new feature in 2013 is we have this little option down here to temporarily turn on and off the analytical model. So if we want to come down here and say show the analytical model, go categories in this view, we can go down there and just turn that on and off in this nice little view control bar. So no longer do we have to go into visibility graphics, turn it on, turn it off, and adjust what we want to see. It's just come down here and hit that button, and you can see that now it's turning on all of the analytical sides of what's going on in the model. If I am doing that, I still might have to go back to the wireframe to see what's going on in wireframe, etc. For me, I have a lot of my materials set to be transparent. So when I go set this up and get into here, I have a lot of transparency on the material, so therefore I find it easier if I am in shaded mode or anything like that I can see what's going on, because I have all of that stuff is slightly transparent in my visibility graphics. So just one of those settings you can do. And if you really want to, you also have temporarily only display the analytical. So if I come down here and hit that button, now I'm only seeing the analytical properties of the beams, columns, walls, etc. I'm not seeing the analytical properties of everything. So just wanted to kind of show how you've got that nice little feature in there to be able to temporarily show it all, do what you want to do there. You also have in the visibility graphics, you have the capability, because analytical models is under its own category. I know in previous releases we had the capability to go through and turn on the analytical, turn off the analytical, but it was on each individual subcategory. So I had to go to floors, expand floors, and turn on the analytical floors, go to walls, go to columns, go to beams, go to or structural framing, go to all those different categories to turn this stuff on and off. Now you have the capability to turn it all on and off when you get into it. The other thing is just make sure I am in Revit, not specific Revit structure or Revit architecture. I'm in the building design suite version of Revit. So as you can see, my last presentation was mostly on architecture, so I had architecture checked inside of here. So if you do come to the analytical models and visibility graphics, you're like, there's nothing there. Check your discipline to see what discipline you're looking at, because if you have structure unchecked, that's the only elements that have analytical properties that I'm going to be talking about, so we need to make sure we have structure checked there. So make sure structure is checked. And you can see I can turn the things on and off here as well, but basically when you hit the little button down in the view control bar, all it's doing is turning this on or off. So if I come down here and turn it off, you'll notice that this is unchecked. If I come down here and check show analytical model properties, what that's done is it's went into my visibility graphics and checked that tab. So all that button in your view control bar is doing is turning on the analytical properties in the visibility graphics. So turning that tab on, turning that tab off. It's kind of one of those things to get started with as you get into. So the other thing I want to talk about before we start getting into the actual adjustment in analytical is there are settings for the analytical analysis things inside of there. So if I go to my structural settings, and I always get to those from the structure panel on the structure tab. So I'm going to come down here and hit my structural settings. You do have an analytical model settings inside of here. So we can start coming down here and say, okay, what do we want to be looking for? On the bottom, we actually have differentiate ends of linear analytical models. What that actually means is, do I want to see the red and the green on the fronts and backs of the beams? So on this beam, you can kind of see I have, we'll get out of thin lines, you can see I have the green lines on this end and the red lines on that end. Green letting me know that's the start of the beam. Red letting me know that's the end of the beam. So we start talking about start reactions, end reactions, things like that for going out to analytical programs, then we can see which side of the beam that's going to go to for that. So a lot of times, even when I'm just simply modeling, and I might be wanting to play with the start elevation or end elevation of a beam or something like that, a lot of times I'll go turn the analytical model on, because therefore I can see the green is the start, the red is the end. So I don't have to think about, oh, am I elevating the start of this or the end of this as I start sloping these members up and down? I can just look to the green or the red to see what's going on. So it's a nice little feature you have inside of there. You can also go in and change the colors of that if you don't like the red and the green. I know the other Brian, or the Brian that works, one of the Brians that works at CAD-1, he's colorblind, so he really can't differentiate between the red and the green on that. So I believe he's went on his and changed his colors from red and green to be other colors. So that is a possibility to do that.
Amazing.
So other things you'll have in the structure for the analytical model is you can start getting down here, and most of the stuff above here is going to be talking about the physical consistency check. One of the things you can do is automatically have Revit check if members are supported or not. Yeah, this is not something that I normally have run all the time, because I have it turned on all the time, and I go draw a column. Before I draw a column, then once I get into there and start pulling it back, it's going to tell me that column's unsupported. Because until I put a foundation underneath that column, it's not supported. So you start getting these warnings popping up on you constantly. So very rarely do I run the automatic checks. But there are some checks inside of here. If you are going to go do member support checks, and you can do those manually as well, there are going to be some tools inside of there to allow you to go through and set those up. So I'm not going to get too much into those. I more want to start talking about how do we change what's going on with the analytical model, how do we change the properties and see what's going on in the files. So one thing I like to point out that did change when I get inside of here, and prior to 2013, when I came and selected a column, I had all these analytical property values to that column. And in 2013, they disappeared. Because one thing I want to point out is when I grab a column, there's two parts to the column or beam or whatever I happen to have selected, wall, etc. So there's an analytical side of the object as well as the 3D or physical aspect. So when you just come down here and grab a beam or a column, by default, it's just going to the structural column. But we can go to the analytical column and see all of those analytical properties. So this is kind of one of those big things when we start looking about it. Are we grabbing the physical object or are we grabbing the analytical object? So always pay attention to that. You can also use the tab key to grab the structural column or the tab key to grab the analytical column or analytical beam or analytical floor, etc. So that way when I come over here, it's just choosing which one of the drop down it's displaying for me. It's not like if I choose the analytical, I can't get to the physical properties, or if I choose the physical, I can't get to the analytical. It's just which is the default it's going to give you on the screen. So I guess the one question is on that is it harder to hit the tab key to get what you want, or harder to hit the drop-down list to get what you want when you're looking at the object? So just wanted to make that aware. Now, if I do come down here and say I'm going to be only displaying analytical, then of course you're grabbing the analytical column, so it's going to give you those values first. But even though the physical part isn't being displayed, again, you can still get to the three-dimensional physical part of that object as well. Okay? So all of these objects that we start looking at, you can see the analytical portion of it can be independent of the 3D portion. And where I think it's most apparent on is when we're looking at brace frames. So brace frames are usually the most apparent when we start looking at what's going on. And so it's not so confusing here. I'm going to go set up a 3D view where I can look just at the brace frames, and we'll talk just a little bit about doing those for right now. So I'm going to go to my 3D view, and I'm just simply going to duplicate this view. Then I'm going to go to my view cube, and I'm going to orient this view to one of my elevations, and I believe I have a framing elevation in this one, which I do. So you can always orient 3D views to other views to kind of, help see what's going on in the model, to help figure out what you're doing a little bit better. With that brace frame, it was actually cutting through the center of the object, so I'm going to go ahead and pull that view back a little bit so I'm actually looking outside of it, not just cutting through it right at the grid line. So once we start looking at this, it's pretty apparent that when you start kind of seeing what's going on with this analytical of this object, and especially if I go look at it more in an elevation type view, that here's the 3D aspect of the object, and yet here's the analytical aspect of it. So the analytical lines, what they're trying to do is connect and create all of those nodes as they go through. So rather than this 3D object, which is snapped to the mid-center line of the end center line of this beam, analytically it knows I need to connect up here to the analytical side of this beam. So this is connect analytically, this is connected analytically, and as of the beam, those objects are all being connected at that same node, understanding. So when I export out to an analytical program, whatever that may be, I need to have that clean connection for all of those. But a lot of times people start coming here and saying, well, that's not what I want. So how can we go about changing those objects? So if I come down here and I'm just going to grab this beam, for instance, and I go switch to the analytical portion of that beam, you're going to see you've got a lot of these different things up here. So if you're going out to structural analysis, you can actually talk about your start release and your end release conditions. You can come down here, and if you say user defined, you can check however you want that to be. There are some predetermined rules that if I go say it's going to be pinned, it says, hey, it's going to be pinned in the MY and the MZ. So you can determine on your analysis side of things. What I really want to look at right now is the analytical alignment. So when I start looking at the analytical alignment of this beam, you're going to see that there's start alignment and end alignments. So this is more for if we're getting into like a sloping beam, where do you want the start and end alignment to be? And by default, everything out of Revit starts coming up with auto detect. So what we can start doing inside of here is rather than auto detect, we can say, hey, I want to go to a projection. And once you change that projection, you can then start determining what part of the projection do you want it to be in the Y and the Z. So on the start alignment, which is the green over here, where do I want this to be in the Z direction? Well, maybe in the Z direction, instead of being at the location line, I really want to associate this to a level. So maybe I'm going to come up here and say, I think that's level 2. We're going to put that at the top of steel level 2, which happens to be where that is. Or maybe I wanted to come down here and say, let's go to, I think there's bottom of the element. So rather than having this go up to the top of the element, I want to take this and have it come down to the bottom of the element. Or I can choose to maybe say middle of the element. I again then have to do that for the Z direction on the start side, and maybe here I'll say middle of element. You can see as I take that to go down to the middle of the element, it automatically brought the brace frames with it. So you can start to see that those brace frames are looking a little bit more clean on what actually is happening with those. So that's why the analytical things are starting it off. Now you can also change more than one object at a time. So if for whatever crazy reason I wanted to grab all of these, we'll just grab the 3 middle ones, and say those want to go to the middle of the analytical object, I'm going to go grab my analytical beams. And again, I'll say projection, and then I'd say middle of element. So projection on the end, and say middle of element here too. So if you really need to go through and change objects, you don't have to do them one at a time. You can do those multiple objects all at the same time. And this is going to be true for anything we get into, beams, columns, floors. You're going to have the capability to really start going through and adjusting where that analytical aspect needs to be in relationship to the object. You'll also see that when we got in there, we had the Y analytical adjustment. It's kind of hard to see here. Let me just pull this crop region in, or my section box, excuse me, in a little bit. So if I kind of come over here to the side and start looking at this, now you can see my 3D objects are lined up to the center of these columns, but all of a sudden these are all bounced out way to the edges of the columns. And you might be wondering, well, what the heck is going on? Why did my brace frames and my beams bounce to the outside of where the columns are as opposed to being in the center? And actually, it doesn't even look like all of them did it because these ones are actually centered on it. So the reasoning for that and what happens is there's a chain effect as we start looking at that auto detect. What's happening is if we go all the way down here to the ground, that we have a wall down here. And I'm going to hide my floor temporarily. So we have this wall down here, and this blue analytical line is the analytical line of that wall. Well, what happened is this column was sitting on a pilaster, and that pilaster is touching the wall. So what happened is this column and this pilaster both said, hey, by the way, I should probably adjust myself to be in line with the wall. So that way when I go out to the analytical program, I don't have this object going back and forth. So the structural column looks to what the wall's doing, and as this wall is sitting here moving in and out, it's going to say, oh, I need to stay in relationship to that wall. Therefore, the columns both moved out, and then all the brace frames on those columns said, oh, gee, we should move out to there too. If that's something you don't want, similar to what we had with the column, or with the brace, we can do with the column. So if I grab this column, I'm going to grab the column above it as well, that I can have the capability to go to these analytical columns and say, oh, gee, what do we want to do for the base alignment, the base extension, the top alignment, the top extension? So I'm going to go look for the base alignment. You can see same thing. I want to do projection. So the base in the X or the Y. What are we looking for in the base in the X and the Y? So I can come down here and say, you know what, let's just go to center of element, and let's go to center of element. And of course, we need to do the same thing for the top. And we'll go center of element and center of element. So now you can see what happened is it took the analytical lines from those columns and moved them to be the center in the X and the Y direction. So therefore, when we start coming down and looking at this, it may or may not have moved the wall, and in this case it didn't. So now I've got this column bearing over here on top of this pilaster. The pilaster is still lined up with the wall, but this column in this case is not. So as we start to get through and look at this, I'm going to wireframe, it might be a little bit easier to see some of that. So as we start coming in here and looking at this, you can see that here's my column, it's coming down, and it's now sitting in between what's going on there. So if you want to change that, you completely have the capability to change out objects. And since I had auto detect on most of the brace frames, I think I've adjusted a couple of them, those brace frames will also be set to be moving with that object as well. So as we go to the right view again, back into thin line, I'll leave that line's on. We can see, oh gee, these are all centered, the column's centered, everything's looking good. Oh, but maybe this brace frame here did not understand what was going on. So when I look at this one brace frame here, oh, that's because it's the one coming back towards me. I didn't adjust that column. So this is one of the big things that I hear people say, oh, man, I export out to RISA, I export out to RAM, I export out to Robot. I get all of these errors when I start getting into this. And that's because people aren't spending the time to look and see what's going on with all the analytical aspects of this. It's also understanding how the analytical programs need to work in your project. So another thing that I know, and I believe it's RAM that has an issue with, that if we look at this structural column, we've modeled this structural column to be 3 or 4 feet above level because we're going to put a column splice in there. Well, that's fine and dandy for the 3D physical world, but in the analytical world, a lot of the programs, this will wreak havoc on that. So if I grab this structural column here, kind of the same thing, I need to go look at that structural column, and what am I doing on the top alignment of this for the extension? So on the second ago, we looked at the X and the Y at the top, but what about that extension? Well, I'm going to go put it to projection, and what do I want to do it to? Do I want it to go to the top of the column? Do I want it to go to the top of the level? Do I want to associate a certain level to this? What do I really want to do with this column? So I need to bring this column down to my correct level. In this case, that would be 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to grab this column, and I'm going to say, okay, let's go to the analytical column, and for its top method, let's don't auto-detect it. Let's come down here and say we really just needed to go to top of steel level 3. Now you can see it stretched my column down. So I know for a fact that when I'm looking at RAM, I need to have nodes. So columns need to be at an intersection of a level and a grid line. That's how it has to work for the translation going out to those programs. So if I'm going to take this one and say go to level 3, the one above it, I'm going to need to basically do the same thing. So I'm going to come to the structural column up here. I'm going to go down to the base alignment on the extension. I'm going to say let's swap this to a projection, and let's go change it to TOS level 3. So now I've got this column's analytical model going farther down. So if I take this column and hide it, you can just kind of see, and the analytical portion of that column and hide it, you can see that physically my column stops here, but analytically I'm taking it all the way down to the bottom. So it's really going through and controlling, depending on the analytical program that you need, what we need to do for the analytical side of this. Am I doing top projection, bottom projection? Does the auto detect work for me, not work for me? And we don't have to do those on a one-off basis. If I know that I need to take all of the base columns and do that, well, absolutely I can do that from a 3D view. So if I wanted to come into my 3D view here and say, okay, there's all the column splices, you know, there's nothing wrong with me doing a cross-section through here, going to my filter and filtering out only structural columns. And I guess I should say analytical columns too. All right, so I've got the structural and analytical columns. And for me, a lot of times I'll go to my sunglasses and I'll isolate that category. So now I'm only looking at structural and analytical columns, because now I can see over here, oh gee, those ones, they're all floor to floor, so I don't want to jack with those columns. So, you know, I'm using the shift key to select these things. I'm going to grab these over here. Maybe I don't need to adjust all these because these ones are all, well, not those ones, these ones are all tall. And then I'll just use my sunglasses to hide those elements as well. So I can start using those objects to help me grab and change and look at what I want to be looking at on here. So nothing saying you can't do them all at once. So we'll just go ahead and do that again. I thought I had them selected. I guess I didn't. So we'll just control through here. I don't need those. I don't need those. And I don't need all these little columns here. So I'll just deselect those ones. And now I can, again, go to my analytical columns and now start changing the top method on these. Oops, top extension method. And those should all go to TOS level 3. All right, so you can see now I've adjusted those all down, etc., and do the same thing for the ones above. So now you have to do them all one at a time. You can go through and do them above, below, do them multiples at a time, and really start to go through and set those up how you're going to need those to be set. Now you do need to pay attention that after you've done that, because it looks like I might have broken one of the columns, because this is again one of those things where this column looks like I had selected the column above, and now this column's analytical model went way down there, so you can see how all those other analytical models can have been broken. So obviously I had one selected I shouldn't have. Not a big deal, because hopefully I should be able to come back here and just stay, instead of projection, go back up to the auto detect and put it back where it was. So if you grab one column that's wrong, go back to the 3D view, make sure it's doing what it should be doing, and that you don't have the crazy analytical lines looking like spaghetti going all over the place. All of a sudden your structural analytical model looks like a MEP wiring diagram. Like, oh, wait a second, what happened here? And it's just taking time to go through and start setting that information up, really going through and paying attention to what's going on, how is this all playing together. The other thing that you need to start looking at are what's going on with the floors. So do we have floors in here? Do we not have floors in here? I thought this file had floors. It might not have floors in here. Let's go to my visibility graphic and see if I have floors. I do have floors on. I might not have modeled floors in this one, so I might have to go create a floor real quick because I wanted a floor on the structural side. Let's just check. Nope, no floors. I'm going to go to my level 2 and I'm going to place in a floor real quick like. Thought there was one in here. I guess I chose the wrong file. Metal deck, that looks great. I'm going to pick some supports. Guess y'all can just call me a slacker for not having this done. And I'll just trim this together. But I'm not going to worry about a cantilever on the support or anything. That's something for another day. 3-inch concrete metal deck. I'm going to move it up 5 inches. I'm going to finish. I guess I need to draw a little line there. Nope, I need to pick my support again. Forgot I had a step in the model right there. Trim this bad boy up. And trim this up over here. Now hopefully we'll finish this floor. Yay! And I'm getting my great graphics card issue flash on the screen there. So, okay, so now I've got this floor inside of here. So you're going to see the same thing is going to be true of floors when we go into those and start looking at them, that when I start looking at the floor underneath here actually has a solid brown line. Might be hard to see because guess what? It's lined up with the other analytical sides of it. So if I just come in here and I'm going to isolate this category real quick. Oh, I forgot to turn on the analytical side of the floor. Let's reset that and grab the analytical and the floor. So analytical floors and normal floors. And we'll isolate that category. So you will see that this floor, I came in here and I did this, and as you kind of may have noticed that I did this floor, and again, I was kind of picking the edges of the beams, etc., but you can kind of see on this floor here, it's not necessarily lining up. So it's not totally lining up inside of here analytically because I picked the support, but maybe it's getting cantilevered from something else that's going on. So it's again trying to connect, and that's kind of confusing with those ones on below. Let me just go hide those ones. So as you can see, I come in here, it's trying to connect with other things inside of there. My floor may be sloping, so it could be adjusting itself in the z-axis. It could be trying to come through here and make a prettier curve, or it just depends on what's going on. You have to have the capability to start coming through here and really seeing, hey, here's my floors. Are they doing what I want them to do? You'll also see the same analytical property adjustments for the floor vertically. So if I get my analytical floor selected, I've got my alignment method. Again, I can change from auto tech to projection, but then in the projection, I can start saying, well, where are you going vertically? So this is kind of more of your Z value direction. So what's happening in my projection there, gee, I really wanted that to be on the TOS level too. Or you know what, maybe I want it to go to the top of the slab. So as opposed to that being down below the slab, it's now sitting up on top of the slab. And if I put it all back in context by reassociating it, you can also see that it's not on the edge of the slab because the analytical line for this beam is out to the face of the column because the column's out to the center line of the wall. So again, it's all trying to make those connections as it goes through to really see what's going on, what's happening inside of here, etc. So trying to go through and bust that out, figure out what's going on, how are we all doing this. But what's great about all of this stuff is not only can you just adjust it by grabbing the properties, you'll notice that there is going to be highlight the analytical. So I can highlight the analytical slab on this floor because you might be like, man, am I getting the floor or what's happening? I can not only highlight the analytical, now I can adjust it or disable it. So there's a couple things happening inside of there. Maybe you drew a little concrete floor that you don't need to analyze. And for a terrible example, I'm going to use this little slab on grade here. If I grab this slab on grade and I start deciding that I don't really want to analyze it, I can go into here and say highlight the analytical and then adjust the analytical, or I can just say it's not structural. So, of course, I have rebar in this, but if I say it's not structural, I can turn the analytical portions of that off and there's no longer an analytical side of it. So you might be modeling in some braces, you might be modeling in some framing inside of there, anything like that, that you want to go through and say, well, gee, this is just a hanger or this is not for structural. Most of your objects are going to have the structural or not structural value to them. They'll also, in this case of floors, not only can they be structural, but we can choose to turn off the analytical model. So I still have that structural object there, that floor, so I can put rebar in it, but maybe I don't want it to be analytical, so it's not going to export out to my analysis program. So you have complete control on the simple properties to be able to, is it analytical, is it non-analytical, etc. Okay. The other thing that we have inside of the objects is the capability to adjust the analytical model. So you can a lot of times do this by grabbing an analytical model, or you can go through and use your adjust analytical command, which I always forget where it is. It's on the Analyze tab, I believe. So in your Analyze tab, you have this analytical model tools, and these are going to be your structural ones. Again, I'm in Revit, so I can possibly have analytical for Revit architecture as well as Revit MEP. So in our analytical model analysis tools, we can actually start coming through here and doing the consistency check supports and manually adjusting what's going on inside of here. You're also going to notice that if I go in here, it does take me to the analytical model settings. So rather than having to go to structural settings and then switch the tab, I can go to the analytical model settings and just get directly to there. So there are multiple locations to get to that. But now that I'm in here, what I want to do is just start adjusting the analytical model. And you're going to notice that once I say adjust analytical model, I now have this total different look, because I don't just get the individual properties of the object, I start ending up with nodes. So I can come in here and see that there's a node right here, and I can grab that analytical node and now adjust it up, down, right, left, in, out, wherever I may want it to be. So, gee, this is cool, but I want to come in here and grab this, and I want to adjust that node this direction. And notice by adjusting that node, I'm changing the beams that tied into here. The column ran through, so it didn't adjust. But anything that has a breakpoint in this, I've just adjusted the analytical aspect of that. It also decided that that floor needs to keep in contact with that, probably because I picked that support for the floor, so it's adjusting with that node, bringing it across. So you completely have the capability to go through and adjust the nodes if you want to. Not only do you have the capability to adjust the node, but you can come up here and grab just the edge of a slab and choose to adjust the edge of a slab. So I don't really want to have to go grab the corner node on one end and the corner node on the other end to adjust it. I can grab the slab itself and adjust the edge of that slab how it needs to be as well. So there might be something coming through here. You might need to adjust it, or it's on top of the beam. You want to go to the center of the object. You can start adjusting each individual edge of that slab to do what you want to do to it. You can adjust the individual nodes of that slab. You can adjust the edges of the slab. And the one cool part about this is if I grab the slab, not everything else, you're going to see that watch these little icons. When I adjust just this one node and I pull it out, notice how the nodes are like in the X, Y, Z axes, but the second I do them, the nodes switch to be parallel. So now this is a perpendicular change, not a segmented change. And you're also noticing that now I can change the look of the analytical nodes. So I'm going to undo back to square. So when I grab that, I've got a different node this time. And what I'm doing is I'm actually hitting the space bar, because the space bar allows me to get different adjustments. So this adjustment is the one where it's green and blue and red. And if I hit the space bar, now it's green and blue and red the other direction. And now it's green and blue and red with arrows. So you can get different looks on this. And the reason I have the green and blue, red with arrows, this means I'm constraining it to the X, Y in the project. So this one here is the X, Y in the project. So now you'll notice that those icons did not shift and change. It's still moving it perpendicular to the project. But if I hit the space bar, now I'm moving it perpendicular to the edge. So if I've got sloped edges or angled edges, I can move it perpendicular to the edge, perpendicular to the project, or I can choose to move the ends only perpendicular and still keep the move the ends only project-based, but then possibly move the edges edge-based. So you have complete control over what's going on with the adjustments of these slab edges and the nodes. So rather than possibly coming in where I was showing you we had all these columns, of course now I've broken them all. Let's see if I can do that somewhere else. So let's add it somewhere else. So one way of doing it, rather than what I was saying is before I had taken the two columns and I moved the bottom column down, I'm going to grab this one and move it back up to auto detect. So rather than taking that and moving it down, I can grab this node and pull the node down to line up with the other node. And notice how it snapped. So if you want to do one individual thing, I don't have to grab the properties of the base column and then grab the properties of the top column. I can just simply start switching to adjust analytical and adjust the nodes. I can do the same thing over here even though it's already been set. Revit will snap to that. You'll see the location, hey, I'm snapping. And now I've got this one node that controls everything at that break. So you have that capability as you start looking into it to be able to adjust what you want to do, set it up. So now I've moved my column adjustments over, I've moved beam adjustments over. I can really start breaking what's happening on the analytical side of things. Okay. So we also have a few other things going on, and I don't know if I have a hole in one of these floors. Let me just go down to my sunglasses and isolate the category. Yay. So in this floor over here and this floor up here, I happen to have these holes. So one thing that's really cool about the holes is if I tab to get to the hole, and actually I need to be out of the analytical adjustment. No, I don't. Sorry. So I'm going to go adjust my analytical again. So if I grab this floor here, I have the capability to go say, hey, let's go include or exclude openings. Because one problem that you might find is in Revit, if you just simply go down and do a depression, so let's say I go under that concrete slab and do a 1-inch depression. Analytically, sometimes, depending on the depth, it will say this is now a hole going through the slab. And I don't really want that slab floor to be not analyzed. I need it to be analyzed as a membrane. The rebar is going to be stiff through it, etc. It just might happen to have a depression. So now I can come up here and grab my openings, and I can just simply check and uncheck the openings. If I uncheck the opening, that opening is still displaying, but it's just not going to be analyzed now. So when I export it out to RISA, RAM, whatever program I'm getting into, I have the capability to say, hey, ignore this opening, or let's come up here on this floor and ignore that opening, so I no longer have those openings being analyzed. So you have the complete control over openings, you have the control over individual elements to be able to choose and say, hey, what am I doing inside of there? You also have wall adjustment, so the ways to go in and do wall adjustments on it as well, and I'm going to talk about those here just a little bit. And then you have what's called analytical links. In previous releases, this had a different name. I'm trying to remember what the old name was. Can't think of it off the top of my head, but I'll come back and I'll show you the analytical links here now. So it's kind of making sense, hopefully. I don't see any questions coming up, so I guess people are understanding what's going on, or you all fell asleep because I bored you, one of the two.
It's just huge.
So once I start coming through and getting into this, I'm going to go ahead and hit the finish button. And now all those crazy analytical adjustments I made are permanent. They're independent of the physical. But let's start talking about walls. So I'm going to go down to my level 2 view. Yeah. And in my level 2 view, I'm just going to go change it to be medium level of detail real quick. And I'm going to go tell Revit to turn on my analytical side. So when I start looking at the analytical of this object here, you can kind of see, I've got a weird graphics issue going on here, that this is the analytical line for this wall. You're kind of like, okay, why is this wall's analytical line floating way the heck out here? Maybe because I'm not in the wireframe. There we go. So here's my wall, here's its analytical. Here's this wall, here's its analytical. And what's happening on this is Revit is trying to say, oh, you've got this wall membrane layer here, therefore this one's so close to it, I just automatically need to snap to it. So when you start really getting into this, what I can do is grab this wall, again, same thing what we saw with beams and columns, go to its analytical property, and come down and say, gee, for the alignment method, I don't want it to be auto-detect. I want it to be projection to the center of the object. Now it's going to take this analytical line and move it to the center of this wall, which then took this analytical beam and moved it, but now this wall down here is doing the same thing. It's like, oh, now this wall adjusted. So it can kind of be a cat and mouse game when you get into adjusting the analytical aspects of these things, and I'm going to do some 3D over here, that now the analytical of this wall is way outside of it. So I'll go grab this wall, I'll go to its analytical model, and I will say, you know, I want this one to be the center of the element. Give it a second to think about it, and now you'll be able to see back in my floor plan that this one's here and this other wall's here, and it moved all of this stuff back. So as you start going through and adjusting it, really going into saying, hey, I want this analytical line there, that analytical line here, it can be a whole domino effect of objects, and they can start changing around to be what you're maybe not intending for the analytical side. So again, I moved that one. Now this wall down here has it out of the outside of the wall. So I'll tab to get to that wall. Maybe might not be seeing the wall here, so I'll just go back to my 3D and do that one in the 3D.
We are recording this webinar, by the way.
So now I can grab this one, go to its analytical walls, and you can kind of see it's a little bit of a cat and mouse game as I get into this. Now I could have grabbed all 4 of those walls at once and said they all should go to the center projection, but just to kind of show you what's going on and how to get that set up, it's really going through and adjusting that. Now, I'm going to probably have the same thing down over here, and the fact that I should do this from level 1, not level 2. So now down over here, let me go into wireframe. And let me go turn the analytical model on. So same thing here. I've got this wall right here and this wall sitting there, and it lined up with the wall over here. Now you don't have to keep going into adjust analytical, adjust analytical, adjust analytical. You can hit analytical adjustment and grab this wall and then choose to move this wall. So I can go to my wall adjustment, pick this wall, and try this one more time. I'm looking for the grip on the wall. Am I not seeing the grip?
You can't get a grip.
I can't get a grip. Wall adjustment.
It's grayed out. Are you sure you can touch that?
No, I should be able to. Let me try it in 3D. It's funny. This is the class file I use for training level 1 structure, and I do this all the time in there. Oh, it's just grabbing the top or the bottom, I think. So now I think I can grab the move it over, and nothing happened. Okay, I have no idea what I'm doing wrong there. I'm getting the vertical side end of the wall. I'm not getting the top and the bottom of the wall. I've done it before, but maybe I've always grabbed the vertical side. Maybe that's what it was, and I just said, hey, let's move the whole vertical line over. Nope, that was the column. Let's try this tabbing. Let's try this one more time. Maybe I just have too many things going on and picking. Yeah, still not adjusting. So
Brian Juge suggested you move it on up to the east side. Because moving on up.
Oh. So I lied on that because I still have it set for auto detect. It's not allowing me to move it because auto detect is turned on. So I have to go into the wall first and go into the analytical wall, and that's the foundation. Let's try getting the wall. That's the floor. There's the analytical wall. And so I need to get it off of auto detect, and then I could go through and manually adjust those. So once I start going through, again, adjusting all that information, setting it all up, you have the capability to go through and adjust each individual node. You have the capability to start coming through and adjusting those grips and looking at them that way. So now that I've completely broken this, the other tool that I need to show is the Analytical Link. And we're just going to cancel that, and we're going to go back to my level 1 view. So what the Analytical Link is, and I'm trying to remember what that was called in old releases, and I'm sure somebody will tell me once I do this. Let's just say we take this is a concrete beam, posted up to the concrete columns, and I just want to go ahead and take this and align this to the edge of the beam. So what has happened in the past is the fact that if you do this, this does show a shift in the analytical side of things. It used to be called rigid links. That's what it was. So if I come down here and now grab this structural column and I say, well, in this analytical column here, beam, excuse me, I want to take the start and end alignment, and I want those to be at the center line. Center of element, projection, Y direction, center of element. So I'm going to move those over. Oops, that's one continuous beam. So now that I have that moving over to there, there is no relationship for what it's doing inside of this area here. So it needs to be understand that for that beam, I now need to have a rigid link. Or in this case, not the one, where is it? Which one did I just move? Not that one, because that's only an individual one. There it is. So you can see in this case, I moved it over now, and I've lost that connection from this beam to this column to the support. So if I were to take that out to an analytical program, the analytical program would more than likely see that there's a break here. So if I go back to the adjust analytical, I should be able to come into the analytical link of this and say it needs to link to that. And it will add in an analytical connection to that. So you basically are just saying, hey, connect the point from this to this. If I wanted to, I could have adjusted the end grip there and pulled it down to the end and left it lined up with the wall diameter. But if you have a scenario of columns like this, you can go through and put your what used to be called rigid links and manually go in and place your analytical links to get that to happen. So it's a new feature that comes through and sets it up, allowing us to manually control what's going on inside of the analytical connections. Now, the other thing I like to get into and start talking about are sloped members. So I really thought I had some sloped beams on this, but I guess I don't. So I guess we'll just go model some in real quick. I'm going to come up here to this elevator tower. We'll go grab our structure command. We'll throw a beam in. Yeah, we'll say this was going to be, I don't care. So when I come in here and do this, I'm setting this one up to the sloped reference plane. So I'm going to come in here and model from beam to beam, because I do want to just kind of show what's going on with setting these objects up if they happen to be on a slope, because it might not pick up on the slopes of all these angles. So there we go. Looks good. So again, we can come in here and start looking at this object here, and it's all being sloped. Some analytical programs, absolutely they'll let you do this. Some analytical programs, they will freak out on that. So again, just kind of more of what we were talking about, that if I can come down here and grab all of these structural framing members up here, and do these all at once. And then I come over here and say, okay, I'm looking for just the analytical beams. In this case, instead of auto-detect on all of these, I'm just going to go ahead and say these all need to go up to the elevator tower. or in this case, depending if it's up to or down to, and depending on what your definition of that twist is. So I might want to come in here and say, hey, those all need to go to the elevator tower. But then again, for the shapes of these angled walls, which I have it being attached up to the top, I can go to the analytical side of this wall again, and for that top extension, as opposed to projection, I can say I really wanted this to go to the elevator tower. So again, just trying to get this information cleaned up, what we needed to do, how we need to get that set up, grab all 4 of those walls and get those all set up. So now, analytically, if we had a membrane, etc., we could go through and have those all set up. So I think that's one of the biggest issues and things that I see when people are exporting out of Revit to analytical programs is they're not taking the time to go through and play with the analytical model. They're just modeling it, and they're saying, hey, here we go, let's go through and get that set up. And then they don't ever go back and play with adjusting the analytical aspects so we can really see what's going on and making sure that information is going to work for you. The other thing when we're talking about walls, the openings command will work the same on walls. So for some reason you don't want to calculate an opening. Again, you might have a depression in the concrete. You might have like a brick ledge in the concrete, and it might stop at the brick ledge. You want to get rid of an opening going through. Whatever reason, it might be small enough opening and you don't care about it. Same scenario, adjust analytical. Come in here to openings, and you'll see now I have checkboxes for the openings. I just double-clicked it. I have checkbox for the openings and walls as well. So that openings command is not just in floors, it's also in walls as well. So you have that same scenario to be able to go through and adjust those. Now the other thing I always like to point out are curved beams. So I'm going to just hide this curved floor for a minute. So we came in here and started looking at the analytical properties of all of these nice curved beams we have inside of here. Again, they're doing what the columns are doing, so I can go adjust that. But every analytical curved beam has this checkbox called approximate curve. So that approximate curve becomes really critical because I don't think any of the analytical programs will calculate a curve, or God forbid somebody drew a splined beam in Revit. I'm almost positive no analytical program will do that. I'm pretty sure none of them do curved beams, but I could be wrong in there as well. But if we really want to start coming down here and looking at curved beams, we have the capability to say, I want to approximate the curve. Once you approximate that curve, you can now see that as opposed to this analytical line being curved, it segmented it. You can actually do what's called a maximum, I can never say that word, offset, or we can come down and start saying use hard points. If we say use hard points, it will basically analyze it straight at every beam connection. So if there's 6 beams coming into this one beam, it'll do hard points at the beam intersections. In this case, it just came in and said, hey, we're going to analyze this as 2 separate beams because I have the maximum segregated size. I don't know what that actually is. Oh, I can never pronounce that word. So I can go change that to be like 2 feet. In this case, it's probably not going to change it on that one. Let's go make it 6 inches. Depending on the length of the beam and what's going on, it'll start to adjust accordingly. These ones are all pretty short beams, so I don't think it's going to do a whole lot on there. So that is another critical one. If you want to be able to control what's going on as you export out to different analytical programs, you're probably going to want to come down and say approximate curve, because some programs will just completely freak out on this. Other programs will do that for you, but they'll do it however they want to do it. So just one of those scenarios on, hey, that's an option for you and how you want to approximate it or not. So again, if you're going out to analytical programs, definitely go through and get that set up. The other thing that I think becomes kind of critical, and I've got a couple of situations of them over here, is when you start looking at columns and you start looking at beams, there's also this, what is the object? So what is this object going to be is analytically. So if I go back to the analytical value of this, this is not a gravity column. This is a column that's being supported and it's kind of free floating, or it's a hanger. Well, this one might not be. But in the scenario where you have a column that would be a hanger, when you have that selected, you can tell it, are you analyzing as a gravity member, a hanger, or a lateral member? So again, when I go out to those certain analytical programs, it might definitely depend and change how it's going to analyze that. If I say it's a hanger, it's an analysis, it's not. The other thing that we were talking about for the scenario on this beam, I think it was that beam, and not having that little analytical link inside of there, I've lost it again, is you don't have to go into each one and manually draw those. When we start looking at the properties of a column, I could grab this column and say, yeah, that's one not lining up. In my analytical side, I could say, hey, let's go hit the analytical links. And what that just did for me is automatically add that little analytical link that I had not put in there. So I can manually go add those analytical links if I wanted to, or if I just grab the column that it's associated to, I can tell it to put that analytical link in there automatically for me.
Is that where structural people go golfing? Analytical links? Never mind.
Beyond me.
Links. Go, never mind.
So I can set that up. I can go through and have the analytical link inside of there as well. So a lot of those options when you start getting into it. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about before we get to the end, since there's no questions coming on, is the check supports and the consistency check. This is what I was talking about it coming back into the analytical. So there are rules down here. So do you want to make sure everything is supported within 1 foot? Do you want to make sure that the analytical to physical model variance isn't like larger than 6 inches? So if I'm talking about the edges of these column lines moving to the edges of the analytical of the columns moving to the edge of the column line of the wall, what happens if I had a 3 foot wide column? If it moves greater than 6 inches, it's going to find that as an issue. So depending on what your projects are set to, you might want to be able to come through here and change the values of this. I'm going to leave it set for the defaults right now. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say, hey, you know what, let's go check member supports. And I found 29 warnings for me that, hey, there are elements in here that are not supported. More than likely, if Revit finds this as a warning, it's going to be a warning when you export it out to your analytical program. So it's one of those things I tell people, if you run an analytical check just to see what's going on inside of there. So I'm going to hit the show button and see where it takes me. One thing I hate about having red and green on, and let's do a pivot in the view. Activate the view. I can't click on my view cube. I hate that about this dialog. Okay, so theoretically it's orbiting around that column. Oh, there it is. No, I thought I saw it. Nope. Dang it. Guess we're going to have to do it by ID number. I was really hoping to see if it would highlight and zoom me into that a little bit better. All right, you know what? Let's go to wireframe. Actually, let's go say show only the analytical model. Now I'll probably be able to see it. Oh, and I can already see what the issue is with those 29 members. I've got these columns stopping at the height of the level or at the height of the column, but these all go up. So just by enabling the analytical, I'm guaranteeing that those were going to be 2 of the warnings. So I'll go back and do my check supports again. Come on. Yeah. I wish we had how to bring the check supports dialog box back open once you ran it. So what the warning would have been highlighting for me is, hey, these members are unsupported because they're just kind of free floating. I've got the start, stop, nothing's in here. So that analytical check will allow me to start going through, get to these members, come back in here to the top extension of these and just say, hey, these are going to the top reference level and cleaning them all up the way they should be. So that's another pretty critical element in my mind when we start talking about this, is really start going through and seeing, are these elements being supported or are they not? I brought some of those columns down. I didn't bring these columns down. So I have to go back through and clean that model up. And I see so many people just thinking that once they've modeled in Revit, I can be done, and I should go out to Reset RAM, and they should be able to pick up on the fact that I've got a 3-foot gap inside of here, that I've got this object just floating in space. Those programs aren't going to interpret that. You have to go through and make sure the Revit model is picked up. So I think that's about what I had. I had 5 minutes left. I was actually expecting a question or two, but it doesn't look like I have any. Well, if that's the case, I do want to give one plug-in. If you guys are trying to go through this and really looking about going out to analytical programs, I know my wife Desi at Autodesk University and Revit Technology Conference has ran a class there, and you can look at it, and it's Revit structure with analytical software. And what she does is she compares 5 or 6, I forget, different analytical programs and how Revit goes back and forth between the two. So I know Autodesk University had that up on their board, so you can go just look for, it's either under Desi or Desiree, but if you think it's Mackey, you search for Mackey, you should be able to find it. And I got a couple of people saying, yeah, I took that class and it was a great class. So if that's something you want to look at once you get into these analytical things, or if you're even starting to approach the thought process of taking out its analytical program, I highly recommend looking at what she did for those, because it's just trying to be an unbiased opinion of how it goes back, how it exports out to the program, and how it comes back. So she's not an expert in all of the analytical programs, but it's definitely one of those things that she goes through and did. And it's something that one of the architects online said it's something even an architect could understand. So kind of let you know how you need to get this stuff set up. But the key thing is, don't yell that Revit doesn't export, it just doesn't understand it. Come back through and check the analytical things. Make sure it's going to be there, and try some small exports out to your analytical program. Because once you get the hang of it, and once you understand what it's looking for, I have quite a few clients who can get that out there the first time and get Revit to go out and export nicely to their analytical program. So just as long as you've got it set correctly in Revit for how that analytical program needs to interpret it. So I hope that made sense to everybody. And if you guys do have any more questions, thoughts, or concerns, you can feel free to email me on my blog. You can email CAD-1. There's their website. Or I also have a blog where I get into a lot of the things about Revit structure and how to start using some of those tools. So, and hopefully with 2014 coming out, we'll have even more fun tools for adjusting analytical model. Apparently, and I haven't tried it, it's going to export out even better to analytical programs. So hopefully we'll actually truly be able to get into multiple versions of round tripping. And with that said, I thanks everyone for participating and hope to see you in the next one.
Have a nice day, guys. Bye.